Again, my name is Jess. I'm the comms manager for the Cask. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to have some folks from our friends over at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center sharing some of their work with us today, and we're very excited. Just a quick introduction for anybody who is new. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the Midwest CASC, as we call it. And the CASCs are partnerships between the U.S. Geological Survey and consortiums of research institutions in regions across the United States. We are the Midwest region, and as I said, the North Central region is going to be joining us today as well. So we've got an exciting little crossover opportunity for you. And we are all part of a national network of these casks that produce science to inform resource management efforts and help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. Some of the ways we go about that mission is by supporting, of course, USGS-funded research projects at our member institutions here. We support a network of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who are doing climate adaptation research relevant to priorities in our region. We host workshops, professional development opportunities, and an annual conference, which we just had a couple of weeks ago, and I have a little photo from that on our next slide. Thank you to everybody who joined us there. We had a great turnout. We got to hear about a lot of Midwest Cask projects that are happening around our region. We got to hear from a lot of those students who I just mentioned, and folks had a lot of good opportunities to connect with each other about their research and about the work that they're doing to hopefully spark new collaborations in the future. So thank you again for everybody who joined us. We had a very good time, and we'll have a little bit more robust recap of that up on our website soon. And then a little later this fall, we are going to have a virtual event. This is a climate communication training scheduled for September 30th on Zoom. I think Sarah's going to drop the registration link for that in the chat. That is going to be led by our colleagues at the Missouri Department of Conservation and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, talking about how you can effectively talk about climate and engage members of the public in your work. So I encourage you all to join us there. That is it from me. I'm going to hand it over to Megan to introduce our lineup for today and kick us off. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Jess. Yeah, we're all really excited to be talking about this project, which is a perfect example of two different casks working together or working on landscapes that cross both. I'm going to share my screen. All right, is it looking good again, Jess?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right, so this work is focused on evaluating ecological efficacy of climate adaptation. And we're going to start with sort of a general conceptual focus on those ideas and then jump into the specific focus of woody encroachment work that we've all been doing. So to start out, I'm going to present the whole time, but this is a huge collaborative group. And I want to make sure that we all have times to introduce ourselves and kind of give the connections to this specific project. So I'll start with myself and then we can kind of just go down the order of the list. So I'm Megan Ford Oldfather. I'm a biologist with the NCCAS, so North Central CASC. And my background's largely in vegetation ecology in mountain landscapes, but I've been working a lot on thinking about how do we conceptually and quantitatively evaluate the efficacy of commonly recommended climate adaptation actions. And as part of that work, I've been working with some folks at CU Boulder and TNC to think more about this. So, Marissa, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Marissa Allering. I am our Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And I have the immense joy of being cross-cask in my work. So getting to work with the Midwest and the North Central on many different topics. And this is definitely a great example of how this crosses the borders for us, and I think also for the casks. And I will just say that this work, for me, grew out of, in my role, I work very closely with our land managers, and my role really is like science translation and science support for our conservation work. And we've done a number of climate adaptation planning work for some of our landscapes. And one of the things that became very apparent to me in that is like the metrics are the last piece of a climate adaptation plan. And any of you who have ever been through a planning process know that can be very exhausting, right? It's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of and people are, at least the people I work with, are very action oriented. And so we get to the end of the plan and people are like, yes, we decided what we're going to do. Like, we just want to go do it. And yeah, we'll measure some things. And so it's like, by the time we got to the end, the like adaptation metrics pieces were always like, not as well developed as maybe my science brain would like to see them. And so this project was really like, how do we get better at helping people kind of develop those adaptation metrics? And also knowing that the literature is very clearly pointed out, this is a gap. And we're out there doing these things, and we should be filling that gap. And how do we help our managers do that better? And the woody encroachment piece is something we struggle with across many of our grassland landscapes across the Great Plains and the Midwest. And so seemed like a really good topic and space to do that. There's definitely a lot of energy. So sorry, that was a long introduction, but I'm very excited to share all this with you. And I guess I'll pass it over to Terry now.
Hi, everyone. Terry Schultz. I'm a senior conservation ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. And I essentially do what Marissa talked about, but for the Colorado program. And our woody encroachment issue tends to be more in our riparian areas. We are such in the dry side of the plains that we don't have a lot of trees that want to do, or woody things that really can survive much in our grasslands, except in that riparian area. So that's what brought me to the table and brought our practitioners wanting to be a part of this project, which you'll hear a little bit more later. And I will pass it on to Kim.
Hi, everybody. Kim Hall, also with the Nature Conservancy. I'm with our North America Science Group, and I am one of the PIs on the Midwest Cask. So very excited to represent the Nature Conservancy in our consortium and to have our amazing project team presenting to our Midwest group. In terms of my role in this project, I've done some work basically trying to help facilitate these kind of interactions where we know we've got a lot of great data in the field from people that, as Marissa and Terry suggested, are like out there doing amazing things, but may not always get all the way to the end in terms of evaluation and understanding how they're working, and especially how they're working in a changing climate. So I'm really excited to see this work moving forward, and I'd love to see more of that also happening in our Midwest cask. So please get in touch if you have ideas on similar projects, and I'd love to help make that happen. And I pass it on, I think, to Heather.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Heather Yoakum. I am a research scientist at the University of Colorado Boulder and also the lead social scientist at the North Central Cask. And I also get to run the RCAP, or Rapid Climate Assessment Program, which is one of our programs at the Cask. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But yeah, this project was really cool because it kind of brings together, or kind of highlights, the way that we can bring social science to really kind of help amplify some of these more ecologically focused projects, and also use the RCAP, which again is kind of this little really quick rapid assessment science projects that we do. And M. Wright, who I don't believe is here today, but they were our fantastic graduate student that we worked with this summer. So Em and I were able to interview a bunch of different resource managers who are actually working on the question of woody encroachment, and kind of bring those findings to this team to kind of help inform this bigger project where we're trying to think about how we can sort of support their decision making and management in a larger context. So that's what brings me here today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. Yes, I find that so helpful to kind of see where all the pieces fit together. So hopefully you all did too. All right, let's get going. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a step back, and we can really think more about what are we talking about when we're talking about ecological adaptation efficacy. And I feel like it really boils down to, like, if we did something on the landscape, if we took an action or decided to not take an action, did it work? Did we actually reach the goals that we want to? And when you bring into a climate context, do we expect that it will continue to work? into the future. And so there's a couple main needs for why we would want to assess efficacy. And one is to demonstrate a return on investment, demonstrating that where we're putting our energy and our money is actually making the impact that we think it is. It also can limit the risk of not having a high return on investment or ineffective or even maladaptive actions. And then lastly, within the context of climate change, it's really important that we're having proactive, robust management interventions, both for now and into the future. And as Marissa mentioned, there's been some very wonderful recent synthesis papers that's really showed that there's limited scientific evidence supporting the efficacy of commonly recommended management actions that are considered climate adaptive. And I want to be very clear that that doesn't mean that there's evidence that they don't work. It's just there's no evidence at all in the literature of if they do or do not work and in what contexts. So the way that I'm defining ecological adaptation efficacy, and this is from a work in review that I'm leading along with Dr. Sarah Weiskopf. And how we define it is it's the degree to which an actions achieve natural resource management objectives, both now and under a changing climate. And so again, it still leads you back to the question of metrics in the sense of what does it mean to achieve those management objectives? So, this could be considering involving reducing risk, avoiding unintended consequences or unavoidable loss, mitigating those, or achieving some desirable outcome. And something that's really come out to us in thinking more about ecological adaptation efficacy is that it really needs to be framed within a climatological or ecological context. So oftentimes we have these commonly recommended climate adaptation actions, such as increasing connectivity, planting arid or more xeric adapted plant species. There's a whole range of them, what we often think, but they're sort of proposed as a blanket statement of this might work. And we're really trying to dive more into the data and think about where do we feel confident that it will work, and where can we really say this isn't a good idea to be doing this if it gets hotter and drier. So again, there's been this recent review of studies that have shown that if you look across a range of climate adaptation actions, a lot of those actions are supported by general guidance or general ideas about how ecological systems respond to climate. But there's no studies that actually met the criteria of climate adaptation action with monitoring of that effectiveness or a quantification of that effectiveness after the action was taken. And so this is a huge gap, again, as Marissa and Kim mentioned, is that we need to understand if the things that we're doing and that we're recommending as scientists actually work. So this group, this previous paper was by Laura Hansen and group of collaborators, and that group also put out another paper in 2005 that's also starting to look at not only that there's no evidence for this, but also where might we expect to see evidence, which I think is really important because as you'll see in the next couple slides, this is not an easy thing to do. I think there's the main reason why we don't have literature on this is because it's really hard to do, and it's hard to do well, and it's hard to do well at the scale that is needed. And so there's been this interesting synthesis work that has looked at where you might be more likely to be able to detect the efficacy of a climate adaptation strategy. So you might be more likely to be able to see it if there's like one stressor, if the response time is short, if it's easy to get out there and measure these things, and if the target is concise. And so what we're proposing here is to say that the CAS network has a really great potential to help advance the effective adaptation actions, because we do foster this strong relationship between practitioners and scientists. So we have people that are doing stuff on the ground, and then we also have the scientists that can both support the collection of efficacy data as well as the analysis in it. So the main concept is that we're really trying to speed up the learning on a subset of more analytically tractable strategies that will maybe provide examples of ways that we can do this, and so other people can kind of take that and move forward. And I'm going to have a couple of those examples before we jump into the really focus on woody encroachment. Okay, as I said before, this is a hard thing to do. It's hard to assess just generally if a management action had the hoped for effect. And it's even more challenging to do this within climate change. So in this recent review, we broke down what we think some of the main 5 challenges are. And that first one is a lack of appropriate metrics, which is a lot of what this woody encroachment project is trying to get at. And so I think a really great example of this is we often talk about we want things to be resilient to climate change or a resilient landscape. That's very hard to measure. And what does that actually mean when you go out into the field or you're looking at remote sensing data? And what are you actually looking for as, after the treatment that would allow you to quantify that resilience? So oftentimes we need to dive deeper and say, are we really looking at like the amount of grassland species? Do we not care if the number of grassland species change? And we're really interested in the resilience of those bird populations there. So I think there's going to need to be more discussions about what it is appropriate metric, and also at the time scale. Do we care if it only has an impact after 5 years, or do we need it to have an immediate impact? The second main challenge is a lack of relevant counterfactuals, and this is exacerbated by climate change. So oftentimes when we implement an action, we might follow what that landscape is doing there. It is less likely that we just follow a nearby place where we also didn't do an action. It's just not commonly done. It's more work. And there's been a big push in the climate adaptation literature to start really thinking more about the implementation of a climate adaptation action as an experiment. So building in those controls to try and understand what would the landscape do if we hadn't done that action. The next 2 challenges are related to the temporal and spatial variation in ecological efficacy. It's hard to just say, did an action work? But really there's going to be, did it work where? And for how long did it work? Or how long did it take until it did work? So there's just due to the general complexity of these ecological systems, we're not going to see the same response to an action in different places. And then lastly, especially with climate change, there's irreducible uncertainty in what the future will look like. And so there's challenges in understanding if we think an action that is currently effective will be effective in the future. Okay, to dive a little bit more into the climate complication, we've laid out how we've been thinking about climate change impacting management action. So we're trying to separate these out because these things all kind of impact each other and it can be a little confusing. So one, climate change can impact the feasibility of an action. So is it harder to have a prescribed burn because we're seeing more hot, dry weather? That is like a singular aspect of this. It also can mediate the ecological response of an action. So this is sort of thinking about climate-dependent impacts. Do we see that as it's getting hotter and drier, we're seeing that low-tech stream restoration is becoming less effective because we're seeing less water moving through the system. That's just an example. And then lastly, climate change can also change the objective. So you can't test efficacy unless you have a clear objective. And it can be challenging to think about how climate change affects the efficacy when you're also allowing that to impact the objective. So it can become a little circular with that. So we've been really trying to separate out this middle piece. The second one is this is the efficacy evaluation. Yes, we realize all of these things touch on each other and will impact each other. But when we're talking about ecological efficacy, we're really talking about that second piece and recognizing that we need to understand those other pieces too in order to understand how likely this action will be both effective ecologically and socially. All right. So in this review, we've also tried to walk through a couple different ways that you can assess the ecological adaptation efficacy, and we distilled it into these 4 different things that I will now walk through. So the first is climate change experiments. Second is observational studies. Third is space for time substitution. And the fourth is model-based evaluation. So the first is for climate change experiments. This is an example where within a manipulated experiment that mimics anticipated environmental changes, you can identify potential adaptive treatments and then apply them and then assess their efficacy. So the strengths of this approach is that you can isolate causal effects by controlling for confounding drivers. And then it also allows tests of conditions that have not yet been experienced. There's also some limitations associated with this approach, which are common for any experimental manipulation. But we propose that these are really best used when understanding the efficacy of short time periods or over really small spatial extents is needed, or if it's very crucial that we have reason to believe that there might be very different efficacy in the future than there is right now for these conditions. A really great example of this is a climate change experiment that's been run through by the National Park Service and the USGS, where they've crossed both a passive rainfall reduction experiment with experimental grazing, done by very cute little hooved shoes. So they trample some of the experiment, and they also have drought reduction, and they're interested in maintaining intact native grasslands. So that's their objective, and they're seeing how is this impacted by drought and trampling, and with that crossed as well. So the main takeaway from that is they found that reducing the grazing during drought might alleviate the negative effects of that drought. So that's sort of saying we think that reducing grazing as a management action might be more important to take, especially in certain drought years, in order to fulfill our objective of maintaining an intact grassland. The second approach is observational studies. So in this case, you're looking at ambient environmental change and you're assessing the efficacy of a management actions. And this can be done with like common before and after impact studies, or you can just be looking at the time series data post-treatment. Or it can be done a little bit more experimentally where you've actually also said, this is another plot, or it's similar now, we're not going to do the action. We're going to see how both of these plots go through time and what happens with them. An example of this is some work that's been done in the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. This group with the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS is trying to mitigate the negative impacts of sea level rise on marsh ecosystems. And so what they did is they removed trees in areas where they thought are now suitable for marsh species and pretty much went back 5 years later and said, do we see any expansion of the marsh habitat into those areas? And what they found, the main takeaway is that no, the trees just grew back. And I think this is a really useful example of the importance of assessing efficacy for not wasting our money, not wasting our time. We can see that this isn't going to work right now. There's something else about the system that we need to understand before we can know what actions we need to take in order to allow for marsh expansion and to reduce marsh loss in this area. The third example of analytical approach is space for time substitution. This is actually quite common and falls really into that sort of general guidance framework that I talked about earlier. And so this is really thinking about if a resource management strategy worked in a place that's similar to anticipated future conditions, like worked in a warmer spot, maybe we could say we think that could identify it as a potentially useful action for our site when it's warmer in the future. There's a lot of issues with this approach. It assumes temporal stationarity of climate biological relationships, which largely just means that you assume that if it changes 1 degree in climate, that the ecosystem will function like the place that's already been 1 degree in climate warmer for the last 60 years. And that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of demographic and functional and ecosystem lags within systems. And so it really is largely best used if you have to make time-sensitive decisions and you don't have that long-term data. It might still give you a sense of what's to do, but it also should be interpreted with caution. A great example of this is an assisted migration work that's been done in Northern England. This group modeled the suitability of these 2 butterfly species, and then they actually moved them to those areas where they thought they should be doing really well. And then they assessed their populations through time after they moved them. And they found that this worked, that those populations established and did well in areas that was farther north than their current northern range limit. And then lastly is model-based approaches, where we're thinking about how population, species, or ecosystems outcomes can be modeled across a range of climate conditions and treatment intensity. So really, this model-based approach may take data from experiments. It may take observational data. When you have multiple sites within that observational data, that will allow you also to do some assessment of space for time substitution. It's kind of more of like bringing all of that data together and putting it in a modeling framework. And so when we do that, this can be valuable because we start to be able to generate modeled counterfactuals and explore different climate scenarios into the future, as well as start to manipulate the modeled system to kind of see where sensitivities might be. Some limitations of this is models are only as good as the data that you put in them. So there's still some of the underlying challenges. And also that it takes more quantitative abilities and expertise to run these kinds of models, which is not always going to be available to folks. A really great example of this is some work done at Saguaro National Park by the National Park Service and USGS, where a group modeled how different simulations of fire behavior and then state and transition models for bufflegrass invasion, which is an invasive grass that can change the fire regimes of an area, how those two interacted with different types of invasive spot spraying or going out to an area and finding a remote area and spraying versus just spraying by roads. And they modeled that under different precipitation regimes. So they didn't quite get to the climate change aspect, but they did get to the connection to climate itself and that climate dependency of the relationship between a management action and the efficacy of that through time. We also argue in this synthesis that we're not often going to have the data we want. We're not going to be able to do this in the scale that we want. And so we really need to be thinking creatively about combining different analytical approaches to overcome different challenges. So all of these different approaches kind of had different challenges that they could overcome and kind of thinking about those in order to say, well, what kind of inference can we gain when we do space for time substitution? And what kind of inference do we gain from experimental manipulations? For example, in space for time might be better at telling you really long-term efficacy estimates. Experimental manipulations might tell you short-term. Can we use both of those informations together to kind of bookend where we think the efficacy will be and how it may operate into the future? And this question that we're really trying to get at is how do we increase the transferability and the generalizability of ecological adaptation efficacy across spatial and temporal scales? When do we feel confident enough to say, we know this will likely work in your location? So some conceptual takeaways from this work, and then I swear we will get to woody encroachment, is that we really push for the inclusion of both short and long-term metrics of ecological efficacy. We push for viewing efficacy as a metric depending on the climatological and/or ecological context. We also think it'd be useful to be conducting more simulation analyses across multiple futures to be thinking about risk reduction as opposed to prediction precision of what we think might have the least negative impact in the future. And then lastly, as always, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the system that we might not have originally thought of. And so thinking about decisions that have cascading impacts that may not be the component of the efficacy evaluation. And an interesting example of this is that there's been some work out in Idaho that has shown that the putting in low-tech or like beaver dam analogs can have a really positive effect on the stream conditions. But then this group, Fish and Wildlife Service group, also did a follow-on that also looked at, well, if you make the conditions so good, do you bring in different invasive fish that then negatively impacts the native fish that we were trying to foster? And so stuff like that is also really important to consider. All right, now we're going to shift the focus to the specific project on woody encroachment. And this is a fantastic photo by Emily Waddell that shows on, oh, I always do this backwards. On my right, no, well, you guys can see. On the right with all the shrubs is places that have been burned just once. And on the other side is areas that have had prescribed burns multiple times over the last couple years and how that changes the landscape and how you can really see it when you establish these more experimental type implementation projects. Okay. So here's a quick overview on the issue of woody encroachment and how people are approaching it in the Great Plains region. So woody encroachment has vast social and ecological consequences for grasslands in the region. It changes the functional and grazing abilities of these landscapes. It's also predicted to increase with climate change. So in particular, with precipitation variability being higher and increases in CO2, there's been global predictions for woody encroachment in grasslands to increase. And so, as I said, we're bringing all of us together to start to assess this. And we wanted to have this larger group, and we think it's important to also be working and thinking more about the Midwest cast too, because there's a really large range of areas that this impacts, including in Minnesota. So we're kind of thinking broadly about what landscapes and what species might be interested in assessing efficacy. So our main goal is to support teams working on climate adaptation by developing, measuring, and reporting on efficacy metrics. So the main gaps in the conversation is there's not a lot of discussion about when or if we stop fighting. So there's a lot of push to just thinking about how do we remove woody encroachment in grasslands, and less about when do we need to give up on an area. It's not a new issue. This has been going on for a long time, and we'll get into that more when I talk about the interview responses. Another gap is that woody encroachment is much more than eastern red cedar. There's been a lot of research on both the cause and the consequences of eastern red cedar expansion and the sort of green wave that's occurring with woody encroachment. But there is a range of other species that are also driving this increase in woody material in grasslands. And we found that for a range of species, there's not a lot of data on what or where different methods are effective. So it's aligned with sort of the general idea that we often don't have this efficacy data. When we've talked to folks so far, what we've found is that everyone is moderately worried about woody encroachment. So some people are really seeing woody encroachment on their landscapes. Some people are not really, but they are concerned about it. There is about a third of folks that have places where they've considered giving up, fighting woody encroachment. And there's also a long list. If you ask folks, what species are you talking about when you say woody encroachment management? There's a really long list, which I have here for you right now. So this list has really opened up, at least for me, thinking about the need to say not only about woody encroachment generally, but like, do we see different patterns of efficacy for these different species? And do we need to be starting to think about putting these in different boxes of their functional groups? Like, do we see a really different efficacy response for shrubs versus trees, or for sprouters versus cedars? The other kind of cedars, ones that have seed, not cedar. And so thinking about all of that and how much this range of species also challenges our efficacy assessment. So we are really excited because we have a workshop that's planned for next week to start thinking about developing some of these metrics for evaluating the woody management efficacy. So we have folks from North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. It's a range of managers and academics and scientists that we're going to be bringing together, trying to figure out what are some things that we can measure that will allow us to give a better assessment of this. So the two ways that we work to prepare for this workshop is we really wanted to both prepare from the social science side and from the more ecological side to be able to get a really good sense of the landscape of where we are, to then say, what do we need to focus on in this workshop? So the first thing we did, sorry, why it doesn't, is we did an RCAP, like Heather mentioned, is we did this rapid climate assessment program. We worked with this graduate student, M. Wright. It was fantastic. And these projects really scope a new research area or synthesize existing research and are flexible and so can respond to partner science needs at the scale of like 10 weeks, which is really great. It funds a 12-week RA, so research assistantship of a graduate student. And that really allows us to synthesize data. And in this case, M was went out and interviewed a bunch of folks and asked some really relevant questions on what they wanted to know about woody encroachment, how they were thinking about climate change, and how they were thinking about efficacy. Oops. Where did my slides go? Okay, I don't know. They got out of order. All right, so first, we really found that when talking to folks, and this is modified from some of M's work, that there were sort of three things that they were thinking about: the efficacy of an action, the priorities of that site, and the logistics. And this really aligns well with what we were talking about before, where sort of climate change can also impact the logistics of this system, the objectives of this system, and then the efficacy of those actions or how it mediates the ecological response. And so there's a lot of things, a suite of information and factors that go into each one of these. I think it's interesting, like observations is things that go into efficacy and priorities, so you can start to see how these things can weave together. We also found that the management approaches are really specific to sites and the species, as well as those broader goals. And so you can start to see that we do need to be thinking about efficacy in this context where it's both about how does it vary across site and how does it vary across different species or different functional groups. Should we be thinking about these species differently if they're native or non-native? Does that change our objectives? And for the site in particular, thinking about how invaded is it already? Like, will it still work if it's got 20% woody vegetation? Or should we really be going after these sites when they have just a few stems that are starting to move in? So the key findings for the interview process is, one, land managers make decisions about woody encroachment management based on many different factors. This wasn't highly surprising, but efficacy played a role, but I think it's important to remember that it's within this broader context. Also, the way that success is defined for those efficacy evaluation is also going to vary a lot by site, species, and management goal. And I think that's going to be an exciting thing within our workshop to really be focusing on how can we distill some of those. So the two main takeaways, though, which have those fancy little blue stars next to them, is that woody encroachment management is really thought about as having to be dealt with forever. So it's really something like we need to just keep burning this site or keep putting in herbicides. It's that's how it's thought of, as opposed to thinking like we're trying to approach this as a sort of one and done problem. And I think that really points to the need to be thinking about, when do we need to stop doing these things? Or when do we need to shift to a different strategy that may have more long-term efficacy? And then also that managers are adapting their treatments through a trial and error and social learning process. It's interesting for me in particular because as like a quant, it actually makes it more difficult to quantify things, to the ecological response to treatments, if like the treatments are constantly changing. Very interesting, but also can kind of make that efficacy assessment more difficult. Okay, so we all not only interviewed a lot of folks in order to prepare for this workshop, but we all also wanted to get a good sense of what's the data that's already out there? Like, what can we already know about how these landscapes are? So we started bringing together a bunch of remote sensing data, and then we ended up largely focusing on the rangeland analysis platform data, which can give you remote sensing estimates of woody and shrub cover, as well as a range of other things. But we're largely focused on the relative cover of woody and shrubs through time. We also were using this treatment and wildfire interagency geodatabase, it's also called TWIGS, which is a database that has brought together a lot of different treatment polygons for different sites, as well as wildfire polygons that kind of say when something happened, how big was it, where was it exactly, and can allow us to kind of bring these two data sets together to see how treatments might be impacting the trajectory of woody trees or shrubs through time. There's also a lot of climate data available. We wanted to bring that into the analysis. This is just an example of the region that we're focusing on, North Central, where we're thinking about both how temperature on the left and precipitation on the right is changing through time. This is just a single multi-model mean ensemble, but if you look at a lot of these projections, there's a general pattern that there's a relatively uniform across the region temperature increase. And then in the precipitation, both annually and seasonally, you start to see that there is differences in the projected changes of those precipitation patterns. And that I bring that up mainly because it could be a very interesting thing to focus on in the future, especially with the known sensitivity of woody encroachment to precipitation mean and variability. So then what work that I've been doing is largely combining all of these data sets. So I've been pulling all the rangeland analysis platform data, or RAP, for 1,000 polygons that have had previously prescribed burns. And so here on the right, I'm showing you a trajectory of shrub or tree cover, relative cover through time. And then these dashed lines are time points in which there was treatments at one or multiple of these polygons that we have this data for. And then on the left, I've also created this counterfactual, which is pretty much I've chosen a random area nearby the polygon with the same polygon size and shape and orientation, and pretty much said, no treatment occurred here. Do we see that this site also had similar trajectories in the shrub or tree cover? I'm going to go through these kind of fast because I want to make sure we have time for discussion, but please feel free to ask me questions about them. So what this figure is now showing is that this is showing if it is getting hotter in a landscape, do we then see an increase in woody cover post-treatment? So largely, you'd expect that if there was a prescribed burn, you'd expect to see a decrease in woody encroachment. That's largely the purpose of doing these burns, although not always. So this is for tree species. Anything on the top of the figure is greater than 0, which shows that it's increased woody cover post-treatment. Anything below is actually decreased woody cover post-treatment. So that's where you'd expect those dots to fall. If you burn something, what happens? And then to the right of the figure is either hotter or wetter post-treatment. So the left is temperature and the right is precipitation. So these are kind of complicated figures, but the main takeaway is that for the red line of the prescribed burn, it largely falls along 0. It actually overlaps 0, which indicates that post-treatment conditions measured at a 10-year interval largely have the same relative cover. So maybe you did do a short-term reduction of a woody encroachment after burning, but things kind of came back. Like there's really no change in that system, which really aligns well with this idea. It's a constant problem that we're trying to fight. And we also saw in this analysis that it didn't really matter what the climate context is. So there's very little climate sensitivity in this. That was just that those lines are pretty flat. And so we're not seeing that in wetter or hotter conditions that measurement changed. And so, sorry, I should have said this earlier. The red is the prescribed burns. So those are polygons that actually experienced the treatment, and the black is the counterfactual. So those are actually not changing through time as much either. It's largely showing that like we're not doing much to the landscape by burning is for trees. However, there's a little bit of a different story when you start to look at shrubs. So these are the same outline of the figures. So anything above the 0 line on the y-axis is actually showing increased woody cover post-treatment. This could be due to a natural progression. Like the landscape overall is becoming woodier, or which is kind of what you can get at with that counterfactual. And so if we just look at the left figure that's focused on temperature, you can see that overall, the black line in that upper left quadrant is increasing. So areas that are cooler are seeing generally an increase in woody vegetation if untreated. That's that black line. You see some reduction in that increase in woody cover with the prescribed burns. So we are reducing it a little bit in those wet sites. I mean, sorry, in those cold sites. However, in the hotter post-treatment side, which is anything above 0 on the x-axis, you can see that in the untreated areas, that black counterfactual, we're actually seeing a general loss of woody encroachment. This might just be the natural landscape. Is if it's getting hotter, we're having less tree expansion. And then interestingly, prescribed burns kind of alleviates that a little bit, which might be an interesting thing about competitive dynamics. Are we changing the landscape enough that it does become able for trees to sustain or invade an area? So lots of interesting stuff. This is a little bit into the weeds at the end, so sorry about that. But yeah, our next stop is we are going to have this awesome workshop at Niobrara Preserve up in Northeast Nebraska, and we're really excited to continue to push this work forward. I'll stop sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. I think we're ready for some questions. So if people have been holding them, you can drop them in the chat. You can ask them live, unmute yourself, raise your hand. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and feel free to ask the other collaborators lots of questions as my mouth is now tired.
Awesome. Gregor, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a great presentation and I think a really important topic. I've got sort of a lowest hanging fruit question that in a way blows past some of the sophisticated stuff you've shown, which I think is great. But I'm trying to connect this conversation about efficacy with kind of one of the messages of Climate Smart, which is many of the actions we take in adaptation are actually familiar, typical actions. And so, are there opportunities to look at efficacy of those business as usual actions in a different context? And what are the opportunities and what are the pitfalls of doing that? And that's sort of like if I have zero effort, zero capacity, and I need to do something now, uh, can I do anything there?
Can I ask a clarifying question, Gregor? When you say look at business as usual actions in a different context, what do you mean by that?
I guess I'm sort of giving away part of the answer, but basically, um, a lot of the activities, right, prescribed burning, we've been doing for years, and there's been a lot of work on efficacy. And how much can we draw on that work that wasn't really oriented around climate change, Is there anything we can do to translate that? Is that hazardous to do because now we're in a non-stationary climate? Um, just wanted to kind of hit that piece as part of kind of thinking about the whole scope of efficacy and thinking that's a little bit on the side, but is there something we can do there, or is that dangerous to look at?
Well, my opinion is that it's not a little bit on the side. It's like smack dab in the middle, because I think that's a lot of what we are, or at least is what's on my brain to do, is because I guess, how do I say this? First of all, we're not doing a lot of metrics necessarily out there measuring things. Also, our managers are out there doing things, not necessarily already thinking about climate, kind of business as usual. And what can we do to just like start doing some metrics, start tweaking things, like, and then just start trying to understand the climate context of those. So I don't know that that's a very satisfactory answer, but I think the answer is, like, we have to take what we have already done or what we already know and think about it in this different context, and then make baby steps towards, like, getting more advanced in either how we're measuring or how we're evaluating or what we're doing. That would be, I don't know if that's addressing your question, but I think we have to start there because that's sort of what we've got.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit there. I mean, I think that's the whole idea behind these partnerships, and I think that's one of the reasons why the CASC is such a great um, organization to be helping this work move forward, because we have, at TNC, lots of data on what we've done that Megan can build from in terms of adding other sources of information and looking back through time with the remote sensing data. And then we can look across multiple sites and try to compare those in terms of, what's been happening and how are they variable, and just like try to data mine as much as we can from what we already know has happened in response to the actions we've taken. And then hopefully that'll help us make a better decision next time we try to implement the same practice.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think it's that data mining aspect that there's actually been maybe not perfectly coordinated, but a lot of data there, and we can look at it and just keep the climate change lens in mind as we do. Thank you.
I'll just add with that. I totally agree. I mean, I think the remote sensing RAP data combined with climate is actually an example of that. Those prescribed burns were not done as climate adaptation. They were just, but I think it is also important to remember that, like, that will give you data at a certain scale and a certain resolution. And sometimes that might not be what folks actually need. I'll just mention that, like, that analysis doesn't give you species specific information. So that could be a pretty big limitation of it.
Sounds good. Do we have any more burning questions? We have time for one more. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Jess to launch a poll at the end.
I do have one question for you. This is Sadie. Oh, my camera is not on. I'm sorry. There we go. I am super curious because I have the great fortune of being in southeastern Minnesota, where we have a lot of very active volunteers in our stewardship area. And so we get a chance to be able to have conversations both amongst ourselves and private landowners that are seeing a lot of these kinds of changes and using fire and grazing in particular as two of the treatments. And we get a chance to be able to work with natural resource managers, so DNR and Fish and Wildlife in our area. I'm very curious to know, especially related to the summary of key findings, the number 4 in there with the little blue stars said managers anticipate having to battle woody encroachment forever. Like, this is not a one and done. These are not, all right, we'll do 3 years of treatment and then it's done. It's continuous management. So, okay, it's 2 questions. One, the first one is, do you also hear from managers then that they kind of feel like they have less capacity then to take on more projects and more sites and more management activity because, like, they're never ending? It's just a continuous add, not a finish and start a new one. And maybe, like, how does that play into our outlook for ability, capacity to manage and adapt in the future? And then 2, is there any element of this research that considers community stewardship rather than natural resource professionals and government agencies caring for this land? And in these ways?
Those are really good questions. I don't know your first question about capacity. I mean, in some level, like grassland management is never done anyway, right? It's just grasslands and humans have kind of been inextricably linked for a very long time. But it is a different level of investment when you're talking about like keeping something back or fighting something. And so, it's definitely a question I think all the managers are wrestling. All the managers I work with and talk to are wrestling with, and I don't know that we have an answer per se. I think it's something we're still talking about, and probably we'll talk about some next week too. The community piece, yeah, I mean, it's a great idea and a great thought. Like, how do we collectively work together, in a place where people are caring for the land in many different ways? I think that just there's logistical challenges there in terms of like fire and liability and like all of those other like legal things that come into play when you're talking about those things. But yeah, it's definitely something to explore, right? And how do we get better at doing that kind of together? So I don't know. Those are my initial thoughts. I'm probably don't really answer your questions per se, though. I think they're great questions.
My quick thoughts are similar, but also in the future, I think it also leads us to what we could and should do about prioritization, about where do we continue to fight? Is it high priority habitats, or there's endangered species, or there's something there that makes it so important we're going to continue to do it, and to ask and work with our land managers and thinking about where are there places where we really need to step back and say that's just going to go to more woodland, and that's okay. That's just, at some point in the future, and it may not be when any of us are still managing, that we need to start having those conversations so that when we really, really can't handle doing the fight anymore at certain places, have we assisted migrated things to where they need to be? Have we done the things, intentionally, rather than it just happening to us and to our places?
Yeah. Okay, unfortunately, we are past our time, so I'm going to wrap this up. But thank you again to all of our presenters. And thank you. I see some comments coming through in the chat. We will be sending out an email with the recording of today's seminar. I'm guessing that our presenters will be okay with me sharing some contact information with them if you'd like to follow up with any more questions.